Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 53 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the Pittsburgh Penguins and won by a score of 2-1. A San Jose Sharks victory, can you believe it, as it puts to an end the 6-game losing streak that the Sharks came into this game with. And interestingly enough, this isn't even the longest losing streak that the Sharks have had this season. Just a few weeks ago, they were on an 8-game losing streak. And then going back to the beginning of the season, of course, the Sharks opened the year on a 9-game losing streak. And yet, because of the types of games that the Sharks have been playing as of late, it has felt longer than those 6 games. The blown lead against the Boston Bruins, the mega collapse against the Nashville Predators, the failed comeback also against Nashville, and then the shellacking at the hands of the Florida Panthers. It has felt as though many moons has passed since the last San Jose Sharks victory, but now one in the books here tonight. And while it wasn't really the prettiest game against Pittsburgh, you could certainly argue that the Penguins were the better team. I'm sure the Sharks players themselves really won't care too much about this. Just the feelings of actually getting a victory with the amount of tough losses that they've had to deal with over these last couple of weeks will definitely be a nice thing to have. Now, when it comes to the first period of this game, it was relatively even on the scoreboard in terms of shots, and of course it was a 0-0 game past 20 minutes, but in terms of actual chances, it was mostly with the Penguins side. They hit a couple of posts. Askarov had to make a few really big saves, and most of the Sharks' chances / shots were kind of far from the outside, where Nedeljkovic, the Penguins goaltender, didn't have to be nearly as good. But because of some good luck and of Askarov, the Sharks made it to the second period unscathed. In that second period, this was definitely the Sharks' best of the game. The middle frame here, it is Mikael Granlund who scores the only goal as he continues his mini resurgence as of late. His 15th of the season makes it 1-0. And then we head into the third period. Of course, a very familiar position for the San Jose Sharks going into the third period with a lead. And this season thus far, the Sharks are a perfect 500 winning percentage in these positions. They've won 8 games and they've lost 8 games as well. So it was a toss-up of what we would end up having to deal with here, and right out the gate, it felt as though a very familiar situation for San Jose. Sidney Crosby, just 30 seconds into the third period, ties it up at 1, and you're definitely thinking, here we go again. But just a few minutes later, it is Macklin Celebrini who ends up scoring the eventual game winner, and I'm sure the NHL is salivating at all of the articles that they can write about Crosby and Celebrini scoring in the same period of the same game. Now, this one would then go on, and there would be a few more close calls for Pittsburgh. One of them where the Sharks would have a power play, but then a miscommunication would occur between Will Smith and Timothy Liljegren, causing a giveaway at the blue line, leads to a Drew O'Connor breakaway, who then gets hooked by Liljegren, gets the penalty shot, which I believe was actually the first penalty shot we have seen in a Sharks game this season, though don't quote me on that, which Askarov comes up with the big save on. A few minutes after that, the Penguins appear to score with a very lucky bounce, I believe, off of Granlund right in front of the net, but then it is called back on a very quick review. This was a very easy challenge from Ryan Warsofsky. His previous challenge a couple of games ago, or I believe it was maybe even last game against the Florida Panthers, was a swing and a miss for sure. Here tonight, this was a very, very easy call. Definitely an obvious goaltender interference. So that goal does come off the board. A bit of a break in a way for San Jose, so it keeps the 1-goal lead alive. And then while we do get to some tense moments, 5-on-4 and then 6-on-4 as well, the Sharks survive and they pick up the victory. Moving on to the players to talk about, we once again have the Sharks top line of Zetterlund, Granlund, and Will Smith. We'll start off with Will Smith, who I do think had a very solid start to this game. His first period was pretty good. Then his second period I thought was really good. His third period certainly fell off a little bit. I wasn't a huge fan of his game over those last 20 minutes, but I would still say there were more positives than negatives. The big thing here for Will Smith, and I tweeted about this during the game, is that he has been such a huge impact onto Mikael Granlund, really has helped him bring his level of play upwards after he had been slumping for a good month and a half as of late. And Smith is doing that by just creating so many great chances, not just for Granlund, also for Zetterlund, who has been a huge beneficiary of that as well. It's just at this point, it feels as though you're almost expecting like 2 to 3 elite passes that lead to grade A opportunities from Will Smith per game, because he has the vision to be able to pull these things off. So it wasn't like an absolutely stellar game. I would have loved to see him finish it off strong, but I thought it was mostly quite solid. One other thing that I do want to mention about Will Smith is that I have been seeing the progress in being smarter with the decision makings in his own zone. There were many moments earlier on this season where he gets the puck up high along the wall and he tries very, very often to try to make that skill play. And sometimes this is the correct choice. Sometimes, though, it does lead to a giveaway. And I always brought up the idea of you don't want to self-limit Smith in these types of situations. You don't want to come down with the hammer and say, stop making these types of plays, because these are the types of offensive plays that are necessary to actually reach the next level as a team. You needed to try and let him kind of adjust himself and figure out when he needs to go for these simpler plays, and he has done that very well over these last few games. There are many moments in which Smith picks up the puck along the wall, and when that play isn't open, he just dumps it out of the zone, which you can definitely appreciate. When it comes to his two line mates, as I mentioned, Mikael Granlund very much benefiting from Will Smith, some youth on his line for sure. He has been a lot better as of late. He also didn't have the greatest third period. That's kind of just the case for this entire third line. But defensively, I thought he did some decent things, especially right at the end of the game. You appreciate him filling into that role as he has always done for the last year and a half. For San Jose, he picks up that goal, continues this mini hot streak, and there was a moment once we got to that large slump where it seemed as though not only would Mikael Granlund maybe have his trade value drop, but maybe his contract value was dropping as well. Will Smith doing a lot to bring that back up. Maybe Granlund owes him like a steak dinner at some point for helping him really get back into the good graces of maybe the hockey world. Scouts obviously keeping an eye on what he is doing if Mike Grier is indeed shopping him. And when it comes to the final player on this line, Fabian Zetterlund, I like Zetterlund's energy as well through the first couple of periods of this game. He's been doing a very good job of actually just being open and accepting a lot of these Will Smith passes, which has been quite nice to see. Zetterlund earlier on in this season had some issues at times when playing with guys like Smith or like Celebrini. It felt as though he couldn't quite keep up. Even sometimes on the Lund line situation, it was the case, but I think he has been doing a marvelous job over these last few games of fitting in quite well. So I've liked this first line, even if they didn't have the strongest finish. Then we move on to the Sharks' second line. We have Celebrini with Toffoli and Eklund. So Celebrini, as we know, picks up another point. It is a goal, his 16th. He now leads all rookies in terms of goals and is within just, I believe, 3 points of the total point lead to Lane Hudson of the Montreal Canadiens, though it should, of course, as per usual, be noted that Celebrini leads all rookies by a pretty decent margin in terms of points per game, just because he missed 12 back at the beginning of the season. So a solid game for Celebrini. I didn't think it was the greatest start. His first period, it felt as though he was a little bit off. Some of his passes were going in the feet of certain players or just being a little bit off the mark. So it wasn't a great opportunity opening play for him. But as this game wore on, second period for sure, as well as in the third period, thanks with that game-winning goal, he settled in marvelously, ended up being one of the Sharks' better players for sure, had some strong looks on the power play, maybe could have picked up an extra point or two if his line mate, Tyler Toffoli, was able to finish on some of the chances he had, as Toffoli probably had a good 3 to 4 high danger in the slot shooting opportunities set up by his teammates, by his line mates, in which he was unable to bury on. And usually in the past, when Toffoli has scored in these positions, we always say, Toffoli doesn't miss from this area. Well, he has been missing from this area as of late, but the good news is at least the chances are accumulating for him. Ever since returning from his injury a couple of games ago, he really hasn't been all that great. But tonight, while it wasn't an extremely loud game in the sense as though you were really, really noticing Toffoli all over the ice, he had some couple of slick plays near his defensive zone blue line, slowing things down, opening up for the rush chance with a good pass to either Eklund or Celebrini, and of course, the great opportunities he was getting in front. So a really solid game for Toffoli for sure. And then the final line mate here, we do have William Eklund. Eklund, it was kind of a up and down game in a way, I would say. Offensively, I don't think Eklund did some great things here tonight. There were some moments in which he was working it pretty well below the goal line. He was skating quite hard, and he got the type of offensive zone possession that he does like to do. But as has been the case at times this season, it's one thing to be able to hold the puck in these spots, but to actually then set up a good play with a nice pass or activate off the wall at some point, it's an entirely different story that Eklund has struggled at times times to be able to actually do this season. That's what kind of felt like the case here tonight against Pittsburgh, where there were the good puck touches, but it didn't really lead to a ton. However, on the other side of things, where the ups come in, I did appreciate William Eklund's defensive effort. Like I mentioned with Mikael Granlund, Eklund did get a lot of the time right at the end of the game. Those last few minutes, played a ton of ice time in this game in general. I think was up at like 22-ish minutes. Shows the trust that the coaching staff has in him, and I think he did a very good job there. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, we have Kovalenko, Wenberg, and Luke Kunin. And if there was a way to spell the word underwhelming, it would be Kovalenko, Wenberg, and Kunin, because this third line, there was really just nothing doing here from these three players. Now, some coaches might appreciate having a checking line, so to speak, the type of line that isn't really going to provide you much of anything, but will at least defend decently well. Personally, I feel as though that should be more so reserved for your fourth line. In today's NHL, you need not just a top 6, but a top 9 of actual scoring players. That's how you have success eventually in the playoffs and onwards. So to see the third line, which actually has some decent skill on it, Kovalenko's a pretty good player, Wenberg's a pretty good player, Kunin kind of is a mix, I would say, but has had some success offensively this season, so I don't think he's fully out of place on a third line, and yet maybe just a lack of chemistry. I'm not entirely sure what it was, but while this third line wasn't abused in their own zone, they did pretty much nothing in the offensive zone either, and so there's really not much to say here. When it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, we have Barclay Goodrow with Colin White and Walker Duehr. So a couple of new names here. Duehr, of course, this is his third game with the Sharks, but Colin White making his debut this season, signs an NHL contract here. Now, this was sort of a surprise, but at the same time, I can understand it. It goes back to what I talked about when I was mentioning Scott Sabourin in the previous game, which is the sense that it seems as though the Sharks, at least at the moment, are wanting to keep some of their younger guys with the Barracuda to help them with their playoff push over these next couple of months. On top of that, as I have mentioned previously over the last few games, because it has been exceptionally obvious, the Sharks' fourth line has desperately been missing Nico Sturm in that position, and whether it has been Luke Kunin or Barclay Goodrow filling in as the center on that fourth line, it has been a complete failure in either of those two cases. So getting someone like Colin White, even if he's more of an AHL player, but at least a more natural center, was the attempted fix from a Warsofsky and Mike Greer type of perspective. Now, Colin White basically got 0 ice time here tonight. Both him and Duehr ended up with less than 7 minutes of ice time. Their shifts were very few and far between. Colin White himself, I kind of liked a little bit of what he was doing, crashing the net. Actually had a close to breakaway in this game, but didn't really have a ton of ice time to really be fully exposed to what he was actually capable of as a player. Defensively, I thought he was okay enough, and so there's not a ton to say about him. When it comes to Walker Duehr, what I have really been seeing over these last few games is that one thing, the big thing that stands out about him, he is very fast. He's got some great wheels on him. He's a good skater, also plays a pretty physical game, big guy, so someone, of course, that Mike Greer was very excited, I imagine, to be able to pick up off of waivers. But the kind of detraction from a player like Duehr is the fact that skill-wise, he's not very good. There were multiple moments in not just this game, but over these last couple where Duehr has the puck, he's putting himself in these good spots thanks to his skating ability, and yet he's just not really able to do much with it. We saw him get a kind of partial break in this game, I believe in the third period, where he attempts the toe drag move and he just leaves the puck behind him. There have been moments in which he has the puck in the offensive zone, he tries to skate with it around the net, and then his play just doesn't actually develop into anything. So he's got decent tool set, but actually raising his level of play to be an effective player, even on a fourth line, I'm not quite sure if I see it. The type of player who, once the Sharks do get a good bit healthier with Nico Sturm, Dellandrea, Kostin coming back into the lineup whenever that may be, Duehr is probably one of those first men out, so to speak. And then when it comes to Barclay Goodrow, not as many exciting things to say about him, because unlike both White and Duehr, Goodrow is a known quantity. He was decent-ish this game, but still not great. That's about it. Then we move on to the defensive side of things. Now, the big thing to note here about the defense is that it is obviously a much easier situation here tonight compared to the previous game. You go from playing against the defending Stanley Cup champion Florida Panthers with a ton of big, forechecking players like Barkov, like Kachuk, like Sam Bennett, and now going up against a Pittsburgh Penguins team that plays a little bit more of like a speed style of game and is also significantly lower in the standings, very far out of a playoff spot, you're going to have an easier time, and it's reflected by the level of games that we saw from the Sharks defense here tonight. But starting off with their top pairing of Wallman and Ceci, it was better than in recently, because this first pairing has had a lot of struggles as of late, but it still leaves a good bit to be desired. In particular, I'm taking a look at Jake Wallman. Offensively, Wallman, prior, like the early parts of this season, I wasn't like extremely blown away by him, but I thought he was doing some good things. And of course, you couldn't deny that he was able to pick up some points. But as of late, it feels as though he has been a lot more quiet, even in that area. The only good thing that we have seen from Wallman is on the power play. He's able to keep pucks in at the blue line. He has an innate talent for being able to do this. But in terms of actually contributing offensively, most of the time, Wallman just gets this puck and just absolutely wires it on net as a slap shot, which these days, the reason you don't see a ton of slap shots is that most of the time it doesn't work out to that much success. It can be fine as like I guess a tool in your arsenal, but to just consistently lean on it for Jake Wallman, you're not really accomplishing much in these situations. And so it feels as though Wallman offensively, considering he has been the driving force on the back end throughout much of this season, at least in comparison to the other guys, hasn't quite been as apparent as of late. And that really hurts Jake Wallman, because defensively throughout this entire season, while he has had some great games, there have also been some moments in which he is just completely out of position, making some really bad mistakes. There were a couple of moments here tonight in which that has happened. So Wallman, not hugely impressed tonight, though I don't think he was completely awful. When it comes to his defensive partner, Cody Ceci, not as many low lows as his defensive partner, Jake Wallman, here tonight, but also not exactly doing a ton in this game. So a first pairing that probably wasn't all that good for the Sharks. When it comes to the Sharks' second defensive pairing, we have Ferraro and Liljegren. I'll start off with Timothy Liljegren, who I kind of liked here tonight. There was kind of up and down, I would say. There was a lot of aggressiveness from him. There were a couple of times where he's stepping up in the neutral zone or pinching in very aggressively in the offensive zone. And what I did also appreciate about that, not just from a Liljegren perspective, is that Ferraro, I thought, was doing a really, really good job of actually covering for him. So it seems as though these two players, who have actually been one of the Sharks' better defensive pairings, though that's not saying much over these last few games, is really starting to develop that chemistry. Liljegren did have a few mistakes here tonight. That penalty shot, or the play that led to the penalty shot, even though this is a bit Will Smith's fault for sure. Liljegren, maybe you want to see him just get rid of this one immediately instead of trying to greed with it to keep possession on the Sharks power play. So there were definitely some errors, but I thought it was all right. And then when it comes to his defensive partner, Mario Ferraro, again, I liked the ability that he has been having to cover for his teammate Liljegren in the moments where he is being more aggressive offensively. I actually thought Ferraro was relatively solid here tonight. Not too many complaints about him. And then we get to the Sharks' third defensive pairing. So as I mentioned, the previous game against Florida, the Sharks ran with a third defensive pairing of Thrun and Vlasic. It was the worst pairing that we have seen this entire season, in my opinion, for the San Jose Sharks. It was just objectively awful, and so there needed to be a change. The Sharks very much recognized that, and so they ended up calling Jack Thompson, putting Jan Ruda on IR, so he might be out for a decent period of time as the Four Nations face-off break does approach. I imagine a lot of those injured players for San Jose will appreciate those couple of weeks off, but Thompson comes in here. He actually ends up replacing Vlasic in the lineup, so we get a Thompson-Thrun pairing, and it actually works out rather well. This was one of Thrun's best games that we have seen from him as of late. He goes from being so terrible against Florida to actually being quite serviceable here tonight against Pittsburgh. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier on, it's a bit of an easier opponent, and that's an understatement, but still, there was only one of those classic Thrun giveaway moments, at least by my count, that I noticed in this game. More often than not, he was actually rather solid in his own zone. Not amazing, but decent. And then when it comes to Jack Thompson, he has been playing rather well, from what I understand, with the San Jose Barracuda as of late, so he ends up earning this call up as well. And I thought Thompson played quite solid. A big thing about Thompson that the coaching staff seemed to try and drill into him in the earlier parts of the season when he was up with the team was his ability to fight for his presence in front of the net. I thought he did a pretty good job here. He was actually the defenseman on the ice when the Pittsburgh scored that goal that ended up getting called off due to the goaltender interference. Because he is holding his spot on the ice very well, the player, Anthony Beauvillier, who's trying to get in the face of Askarov, kind of has to skate around him, puts himself in the crease, which ends up creating this goalie interference call. So strong positioning, I would say, in a way, for Jack Thompson to be able to create that, sort of, I guess. But generally, Thrun and Thompson, solid pairing. And then we have the goaltender here. It is Yaroslav Askarov getting the start. So we did see him make an appearance in the previous game against Florida. Georgiev had a really rough start to that one. Askarov came in, ended up letting in 3 goals, but honestly, I didn't really blame him for any of those 3 goals, so I didn't hate him there. However, the previous couple of starts for Askarov left a little bit more to be desired. That one against Boston, he had a very strong start those first 40 minutes, but then a couple bad goals that ends up costing the Sharks the game. And then obviously that one against Nashville was just rather bad. Most of the 6 goals were probably ones he would want back. So an opportunity to redeem himself here against a Penguins team that isn't great, as I mentioned, but does still have some scoring talent, including one of the best players of all time, Sidney Crosby, who would end up scoring the 1 goal for the Penguins here tonight. One that you could certainly argue Askarov could want back, sort of similar to the goal that he gave up against Charlie Coyle against the Boston Bruins. However, as I have mentioned, players in these situations as of late have just started firing pucks on net when there's just a mess of skates and a mess of sticks in front, and sometimes it just does surprise the goaltender. It's rough to see Askarov get surprised by that twice in pretty quick succession in just about a week's time, so he's going to have to try and keep his focus, keep his vision on the puck as we move forward. But that was the one blemish on an otherwise very well played game for Yaroslav Askarov. Made some big saves in the first, definitely made some big saves in the third as well. Big part of why the Sharks were able to pick up this win. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday. They'll be taking on the Seattle Kraken. The Sharks have had some pretty interesting matchups with the Kraken this season, including an 8-5 victory earlier on. And so we'll see if the Sharks can maintain, or I guess begin, a bit of a winning streak here. Class dismissed.